Hello and welcome to the channel. In this video we are looking at American filmmaker Wes Anderson. He is one of my favourite auteurs. Or if you don't go for the auteur theory, which is a whole other video, he is one of my favourite directors. He is known for his unique visual style and idiosyncratic writing, and is considered a key figure in the American eccentric cinema movement. To date, he has made 10 feature-length films and 1 notable short. I'm going to rank his films, starting with my least favourite and working up, and in between we'll take a look at a number of the elements that make Anderson and his work so distinctive. So let's get started with a quick word on his style overall. It has been described as direct directing. That is to say that Anderson has a very distinct and consistent style. He knows it, and the audience knows it. His films don't present a naturalistic feeling world, often far from it, but that is a very deliberate choice. His films are built from the ground up. He writes the stories, costumes are specifically designed, locations crafted to make them feel like they've been built purposely for the film in question. Every film is filled with meticulously crafted detail, but he'll make sure any crucial information will not be missed by the viewer. Anderson's latest is, rather than a straight narrative, a collection of short films set around the same fictional French town of Ninoy-sur-Blaise, if I've said that remotely correctly, and framed together as articles published in the final edition of the titular magazine. The first and most throwaway story is The Cycling Reporter, featuring one of Anderson's regular players, Owen Wilson. If you asked Anderson to create a Looney Tunes short to go before a film, this is probably what you'd get. There are a couple of neat sight gags, but otherwise this section is fairly unremarkable. We are then into the more substantive tales with The Concrete Masterpiece. And a prisoned artist with a prison guard muse rises to fame and then frustrates his benefactor by painting directly onto the prison walls. Here we have Wes Anderson does French New Wave. Benicio del Toro and Léa Seydoux put in strong performances, as Adrian Brody and Tilda Swinton essentially cameo. Following up, this is a revision to a manifesto, which is kind of a French New Wave remix of Moonrise Kingdom meets Rushmore. It, like the rest of the film, looks fantastic, with Anderson's trademark attention to detail, but we just don't spend enough time with these characters to really build a connection with them. Closing things out is the private dining room of the police commissioner, which is the closest we have to the farce of the Grand Budapest Hotel here. The highlight being a short animated segment drawn appropriately in the style of the New Yorker magazine cartoons, since this whole film acts as a tribute to a number of writers for that magazine. The French Dispatch is possibly the apex of Anderson's attention to detail in terms of filmmaking. The mise-en-scène, the cinematography, the staging all drips with care and precision. But as a film, for me, it falls to the bottom of the list because it just doesn't have the heart or the soul of the rest of Anderson's filmography. It's a curio within a set of curios. A common feature of Anderson's characters is that they tend to have an absolutist view of the world. They have a particular understanding of how the world is, and then become disappointed and melancholic when this worldview is proved to be ill-conceived. They can often be contradictions. For example, the Tenenbaum children are all introduced as prodigies in the field, but the versions of them we spend time with seem hopelessly lost and unable to function. Elsewhere, we find children acting like adults, and adults acting like children. All of his characters are flawed. They can be vain, vengeful, manipulative, jealous, greedy, and any other number of vices. Yet, they are still likable for the most part. the audience will still root for them to find redemption. The Grand Budapest Hotel is a Shakespearean comedy as seen through the Wes Anderson lens. It's the tale of Gustav H., a fastidious concierge who seduces old, wealthy guests at the hotel. After the death of one of them, Gustav is set to inherit a valuable painting, but relatives of the deceased dispute the will. This leads to Gustav being arrested for suspected murder, but he escapes with the help of busboy Zero and Zero's fiancée Agatha. The trio set out to prove Gustav's innocence, and after a series of adventures, it is revealed that Gustav is set to inherit a fortune and the Grand Budapest Hotel itself. As the film closes, the high energy farce takes a turn, and Gustav is killed whilst trying to protect Zero from deportation. Zero inherits the hotel, but Agatha dies during childbirth. I'm not sure why Anderson chose to go for this bittersweet ending when throughout the film seemed to be building towards a giddily happy ending. The film is probably one of the more widely popular of Anderson's, but it's one I've never fully clicked with. It's a bright, shiny convection for most of its run, and on that level it works, but it feels a little hollow. The third act swing to melodrama, for me not really succeeding in bringing any emotional weight to proceedings. And the faux Nazi threat at times can make things feel a little bit like a high budget take on Hello Hello, an 80s British sitcom set in occupied France, which has not really aged very well at all. Like Anderson's other less successful outings for me, the Grand Budapest Hotel has a super artifice but lacks the character depth to really connect me to the film. One of the key elements of the look of Anderson's films is the cinematography. A key figure here is Robert Yeoman, with whom Anderson has worked with on all of his films. The pair have developed a strong style between them, with symmetry being a huge element within that, with many frames having a feeling of balance, with the key character placed dead centre within a shot. Or the reverse, where characters are placed carefully either side of a space in the centre of the frame. It's a type of framing that gives something of a dollhouse feel to the films, a feeling of a world crafted by hand rather than simply an existing world that has been filmed. This is backed up by the use of wide-angle lenses, which allow for panoramic layouts. Yeoman and Anderson also favour bright colours in their choice of palettes, both in the production design and the overall palette of the cinematography. In these films, even night is rarely dark, and the darker emotional moments will make use of strong but cooler colours. Anderson's debut feature is also the feature debuts of Luke and Owen Wilson. It tells the story of friends Anthony and Dignan, who have developed a 75-year plan to rise out of their stalled lives. The plan involves a number of heists. They start small, robbing Anthony's own family home, but end up returning a pair of earrings that he had gifted to his mum. Next up is a heist on a bookstore, followed by a period on the run, living in a motel, where Anthony begins a hesitant relationship with one of the maids. The small gang eventually meet up with local crime figure, the eccentric Mr. Henry, who brings them in on a job to rob a cold storage facility. It goes wrong, and Dignan ends up in prison. Looking back, I wonder if the creators of My Name is Earl had seen Bottle Rocket. The cast of the idiosyncratic small-time criminals and the world they inhabit feels similar to the sitcom. The film is very much proto-Anderson, his full sensibilities not yet coming through, and it feels like territory that the director had chosen because of the type of films popular at the time, that Tarantino-style crime story, rather than it being something that really interested him. The oddball family motif that would go on to define much of his work is there, faintly, but it's not yet fully formed. It is not a bad film, but these days it is an inessential part of Anderson's filmography. Of all the famous directors currently working, I think Anderson is the only one that quite clearly has a favoured font. Certainly, it's the only one who makes so much use of on-screen text. His favourite font being Futura, with Helvetica II. It can be said that they match his directing style. They are clear and direct, but also convey a certain sense of careful design. Of course, the fact that his fonts are noticeable in the first place is down to how much he likes to use text. Many of his films have title cards between chapters. Pretty much all of them feature characters receiving letters or reading books, which we are shown close-ups of so that we can read them too. It's all part of that direct directing style we mentioned at the start. If there is some information that Anderson really wants to make sure the audience has received, he'll tend to have it spoken by his characters, and then reconfirmed by a close-up of the written source the character has just learned the information from. It's a double salvo designed to underline that this point is a crucial point. The Darjeeling Limited is, I think, Anderson's most personal film. It is once again a look at broken family relationships, but this time the spectre of grief, which often features as an aspect of Anderson's stories, looms much larger over the film. Three brothers, Peter, Francis and Jack, board the titular train as they have been brought together after Francis has recently suffered a near fatal accident. They have not seen each other since their father's funeral a year earlier. Francis collects the brothers' passports to prevent them heading home early. Tension between the brothers builds as they travel, with each struggling to process their grief over their father's death. Things boil over when Francis reveals that he was planning to lead them all to their estranged mother, who was living as a nun nearby in a Himalayan convent, and a fight sees them thrown off the train. Determined to each once again go their separate ways as they walk through the wilderness, they see a trio of young boys fall into a river. Francis, Peter and Jack race to save the boys, but one of them drowns. Distraught, they carry the boy's body back to his village. After this, instead of going home, they decide to visit their mother, who they confront for abandoning them. As they run to catch a train back to the airport, the brothers discard their father's luggage, symbolically and literally freeing themselves of the weight. The Darjeeling Limited does have flashes of humour like the rest of Anderson's filmography, but overall it is a darker, more introspective picture. There are elements of the usual elaborate production design, but it is more muted than elsewhere. The focus here really is the brothers' emotional struggle. It's a slow burn film and one that I didn't immediately take to, and it has taken me a few watches to grow on me. It's not a bad film, none of Anderson's really are, but I find I have to be in a very specific frame of mind to put it on. It's very much true that Anderson has a group of what you can call his players, a selection of actors that he returns to time and again. It's a group that includes Bill Murray, Owen Wilson, Jason Schwartzman, Adrian Brody, William Dafoe, Luke Wilson, and others. Recently, the likes of Lea Sandhu and Saoirse Ronan have joined the troupe. This, no doubt, is in part down to the fact that Anderson has a good working relationship with these actors, and that the actors enjoy being part of the films. Anderson is on record saying that he loves working with actors, which is certainly far from true for all directors. But it also helps build up a sense that all of the films are taking place in the same off-kilter reality. If the films can feel like doll houses, it's as if Anderson is at play using the same dolls to imagine different stories. Anderson's first feature-length full animation film is an adaptation of Roald Dahl's book. It also adds quite a lot of the Anderson staples to the narrative. It really is as if you'd put the Royal Tenenbaums and Fantastic Mr. Fox in a blender. We have the core tale of Mr. Fox raiding the farms of Boggis, Bunce and Bean, with the farmers eventually becoming frustrated and plotting to trap Mr. Fox and his family. Alongside this, the main addition is material surrounding Mr. Fox's son Ash and their cousin Christopherson, who comes to live with them. This is where Anderson brings in his typical theme of family reconciliations, alongside Mr. and Mrs. Fox's arguments over what is best for their family. The film's pacing comes across as somewhat stop-start, the simple narrative of the book at times getting swamped under the tangents added by Anderson. But there is much to be gained from Anderson applying his normal, meticulous eye for detail to the film and its look. The mostly stop-motion animation is crisp and does a great job of invoking the feel of Quentin Blake's illustrations. It is classed as a children's film, but certainly does not talk down to them. Your appreciation of the film will depend upon your view on the material added to the core story, I suspect. But for me, this cheery take on the material is a strong member of the Anderson film library. Another marker of Anderson's work are the costumes. Every character in every film has a very distinct look. Each one almost has a uniform. Quite a few literally have uniforms. It's Anderson using what Jean-Luc Godard called character uniforms. It's an aspect of Godard's work that Anderson appears to have really taken to heart. It makes each character instantly recognisable to the audience, as well as bringing a set of expectations for that character. For example, compare William Dafoe's characters in Grand Budapest Hotel and Life Aquatic. One is supposed to be mean and unnerving, the other is a somewhat goofy sidekick. One is dressed in black leather with large brass knuckles on each hand, the other has a bright blue tracksuit and a bright red bobble hat. Even when characters all have the same uniform, Anderson finds ways to make sure each character has their own unique variation, such as the crew of the Belafonte in Life Aquatic. They all have the same tracksuit and hat, but each of them are made distinct by the way that they wear that hat. And for example, it's a big moment in the Royal Tenenbaums when Richie changes his character uniform late in the film. The audience expectation of how he'll act and who he is thrown off after the climax of his emotional character crisis through this change of costume. The second feature-length animation from Anderson features, as before, a stellar cast of voices, with many from his gallery of regular players. It is set in a near-future Japan where an outbreak of canine flu has led to all dogs being exiled from the fictional city of Megasaki to an offshore island. The film features the adventures of Atari, a young boy who travels to the island in search of his beloved former guard dog, Spots. On the way, he meets up with a pack of dogs led by Chief, who then accompany the young boy on his journey. As events unfold, we find out Atari is the nephew of the mayor, and that his uncle is behind a conspiracy against dogs, a conspiracy exposed with the help of Tracy, a young American exchange student. Even more than in Fantastic Mr. Fox, Isle of Dogs feel like Anderson making his version of a Disney film. Here, the straightforward story is free from any major detours or side stories. But that's not to say the same level of excessive detail isn't as present as other films in Anderson's catalogue. Once again, there are strong themes around abandonment, lost confidence refound, and strained family-like relationships slowly being repaired following a kick-starting opening incident. Flashes of comedy that reference the medium being used abound, and the Japanese setting allows for a fantastic sense of both place in the location designs and the use of presentation flourishes, albeit presenting us with a version of Japan that has been filtered through Anderson's personal aesthetic every bit as much as his version of America is. It's a charming film that shows animation can be aimed at a wide audience without being dumbed down. Anderson also has a distinct way of editing his films, and as with the cinematography, Anderson favours working with someone he has built up a strong working relationship with. In the most part, he has worked with 2 editors across his filmography. David Moritz worked on Bottle Rocket, Rushmore and Life Aquatic, with Andrew Weisblum having worked with Anderson on everything since Darjeeling Limited. One marker of the way Anderson likes to edit is a transition from quickly moving imagery to a scene where everything is static. This snap of a rhythm change is often used to create a comedic moment, but more interestingly, it is a technique that allows the audience a brief moment to finish processing the events of the scene we've just left before the new scene gets going. It's a cinematic equivalent of actors pausing to allow laughter or applause to die down before they continue. Moonrise Kingdom almost feels like it could be a feature-length flashback from the Royal Tenenbaums. Anderson has said he often looks to tell stories from the point of view of a 12-year-old. Here he really goes for it and makes a pair of 12-year-olds the central players. Sam is attending a summer scout camp when he runs away to elope with Susie, they having become pen pals after a meeting at a church play the previous summer. Finding him missing and a note resigning his scout duties, the scout troop led by Scoutmaster Ward set out in search of Sam. In a resulting confrontation, Susie gets the better of the scouts. Her and Sam hike to a cove where they set up camp. The romantic tension between the two grows as they both tentatively approach their first such relationship. Eventually, the scouts find Sam and Susie's camp. Sam, who is fostered, is threatened with being taken away by social services. Upon hearing this, the scouts decide to help Sam and enlist the help of Ben, a relative of one of the scouts. Sam and Susie don't make it to a crab and boat they had planned to leave on during a climactic hurricane and flash flood. The kids are rescued eventually from the steeple of the church where they first met. By the end of the summer, Sam has been fostered by the local police captain and is still meeting up with Susie, their relationship seemingly continuing to develop. The change of point of view to younger characters brings a fresh energy to Anderson's typical themes. We're still focused on relationships, but instead of looking at fractured ones being repaired, our main focus is the early growing days of new relationships. Jared Gilman and Cara Hayward are excellent as the central pairing of Sam and Susie. The supporting cast are drawn from Anderson's troupe of players, with Bruce Willis joining the mix ably. Moonrise Kingdom often feels like an overlooked entry in Anderson's filmography, but it's well worth your time. A quick one this, but Anderson really likes ending his films with a slow motion shot. A lot of the last or next to last shots on his films are in slow motion. Whilst his previous feature was a sort of proto-version of his work, Rushmore, Anderson's second full-length film, is, if not quite Anderson fully formed, a 95% version of his directorial style that he would come to be known by. Here we follow Jason Schwartzman as Max Fisher, a student at a prestigious private school. Although he participates in many extracurricular activities, he struggles on the more academic side of school to the extent that he is threatened with expulsion if his grades don't improve. He builds a friendship with Herman Bloom, played by Bill Murray, as well as developing an obsession with Rosemary, played by Olivia Williams, a widowed teacher at Rushmore Academy. Eventually expelled from Rushmore, Max finds himself at a public school where he initially struggles to fit in. Herman begins to see Rosemary behind Max's back, and the two fall into a pattern of petty acts of revenge against each other. Rosemary and Herman's relationship falters as she is still mourning her deceased husband. Eventually, Max concludes that his acts of revenge serve no purpose and seeks to reconcile with Herman and Rosemary, as well as help them find reconciliation between the two of them. He eventually succeeds in this at the premiere of an elaborate school play he has directed. We have the central themes of seemingly odd relationships and friendships that crop up in much of Anderson's work, along with people looking to recapture their pasts and a sense of final redemption at the end. Based around a small cast and a pair of schools, this is a micro version of Anderson's world that would only grow in further films. It feels like him finding his feet. It's a more confident film than his first, and it really does feel like a distinct voice starting to fully emerge. We've spoken briefly about the cinematography, costumes and the colour palette earlier, and these are all, of course, part of the production design, but it'd be foolish to overlook of the rest of the mise-en-scene in Anderson's films. As mentioned, he has a meticulous eye for detail. Consider, for example, the childhood bedrooms of the Tenenbaum children. Each one tells us so much about each of them so efficiently. And it's not only the broad strokes of Margot's library of plays or Chaz's work desk, but the very deliberate smaller touches, like Ritchie's portraits of Margot, all being framed differently and hung in a cluttered, uneven pattern. This underlines not only Ritchie's obsession with Margot, but also his lack of any real aesthetic appreciation. Or consider the model of the Belafonte on Steve Zissou's desk, the pristine version that he still imagines he owns, in comparison to the aged and worn reality of the ship. Every frame has so much detail in it, and very little of that is put to waste. Written with fellow American indie cinema alumni Noah Baumbach, The Life Aquatic is Anderson's fourth film, and in terms of scale, it's a step up in terms of its setting and the size of its cast. As we meet Steve Zissou, a fairly obvious riff on Jacques Cousteau, played by Bill Murray, he is preparing to set out on a mission of revenge against the shark that recently ate his best friend. His Team Zissou project is in decline, having failed to release a successful documentary in some time. In an audacious sequence, we are introduced to Steve's boat, the Belafonte, and its crew, zooming in on a model that becomes the real-life ship as the camera moves seemingly without cuts from room to room, as a voiceover from Steve explains to us what everything is. It's Anderson really stretching his directorial style here. He's really making great use of the things available to him. It is roughly 2 minutes of a director showing off, but it works so well. As the story continues, Ned, who may be Steve's son that he didn't know he had, joins the crew, looking to build a relationship with the man he believes to be his father. Meanwhile, Jane, a journalist looking to write a profile article on Steve, has also joined the ship as they set sail in search of the jaguar shark. Various misadventures follow as Steve and Ned tentatively interact and find themselves both drawn to Jane. Eventually, Steve is again forced to face the loss of a crew member as Ned dies in a helicopter accident. Doubling down on the quest for revenge, the crew do eventually find the jaguar shark, but Steve, stunned by its beauty and lacking dynamite, decides to let it live. The following documentary, dedicated to Ned, receives a standing ovation. Once again, this is a cast of characters who feel lost or broken and are looking for purpose. A recurring theme in Anderson's work, and once more the actors shine. In the main roles, Bill Murray is excellent as Steve, who bringing out the remorse, rage and regret inherent in him. Owen Wilson brings an easy charm to Ned, whilst Kate Blanchett's straight-shooting journalist has that right balance of confrontational edge and underlying vulnerability. Meanwhile, a background cast including Willem Dafoe, Angelica Houston, Noah Taylor and Jeff Goldblum, and many others, make for a memorable group, bringing a believability to a range of faintly absurd characters. The fantastic production design is topped off with a fantastic soundtrack that makes great use of a set of compositions from former Devo member Mark Mothersbaugh and Sue George performing a Portuguese covers of David Bowie songs. Anderson's Moby Dick comfortably rests as my second favourite behind only the Tenenbaums. Now, I've spent a bit of time here quickly discussing technical aspects of Anderson's approach to filmmaking, albeit I've not really gone into any real depth here. I'm sure you could probably make a video individually on each aspect. However, my fondness for Anderson's films goes beyond the fact that he is a very accomplished filmmaker in a technical sense. After all, I can see that Stanley Kubrick is a technical master, but I don't actually really like any of his films. Why is that? Well, for me, Kubrick films feel technically proficient, but cold. Or to put it another way, they feel like they are without soul. Anderson's films have soul. In amongst the oddball characters and the seeming artifice of his work, Anderson's films for me do have a soul, a certain feeling of emotional warmth. And the reason why I've ranked French Dispatch as the lowest on my list here is it is the one film of his for me that really lacks this aspect. It feels too much like a Kubrick film to me. I find it hard to really fully describe what I mean when I say a film feels like it has soul. It's an intangible thing that the understanding of will be different for every viewer, but hopefully you have a sense of what I mean. In a strong collection of films, The Royal Tenenbaums is probably Wes Anderson's standout stone cold classic. It follows the efforts of Royal Tenenbaum, portrayed by Gene Hackman, trying to reconnect to his family after years of strained relationships after he walked out on the family when the children were young. Angelica Houston's Etheline has spent her life nurturing and pushing the talents of the three Tenenbaum children. Richie, a tennis prodigy, Margot, the talented playwright, and Chaz, a gifted businessman. All excel in youth but find themselves now adrift. As Alec Baldwin's narrator notes, all memory of the brilliance of the young Tenenbaums had been erased by 2 decades of betrayal, failure and disaster. Also in the mix we have Eli Cash, a friend of the Tenenbaum children since their youth, who has become a noted author, Riley St. Clair, who is Margot's husband, and Henry Sherman, Etheline's suitor. We follow the family as they reunite and interact with each other for the first time in years, brought together by Royal faking a terminal illness. As the film unfolds, we learn about the misfortunes that have beset each of them and the root causes of the seemingly turns to failure. The film represents Anderson really hitting his stride, and the distinct Anderson formula is fully in place. Oddball characters, meticulously detailed and idiosyncratic design in everything from the costuming, the sets, the props, and to the soundtrack choices. With all of it used to service a character-based story of real heart, as a set of broken people find acceptance and new purpose. The excellent cast are all on top form, and this no doubt really helps pull forward the emotions in play and allows the audience to really form a connection with the characters. It is still my favourite in Anderson's catalogue, and also contains one of my favourite shots in all of cinema. The Royal Tenenbaums is not only my favourite Wes Anderson film, but also one of my favourite films in general. For me, it's something of a cinematic comfort blanket, something I can watch time and time again without ever tiring of it. And so there we are. I do hope you enjoyed that look at Wes Anderson films and what makes them so very distinctly his, as well as a quick rundown of which are my favourites. In fact, my top 2 picks here are amongst my favourite all-time films as well. Let me know if there are any other directors you'd like me to take a look at in a similar fashion. And I'd love to know if you like the Anderson-verse as much as I do, and which are your favourites or which are your least favourites. Thanks for watching. Do like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with some more videos soon.